Hi everyone, Dr. K here. I'm going to talk to you about Elethia by Alice Walker. And first I want to start by doing a little introduction of it. Alice Walker wrote Elethia as part of a collection of stories called You Can't Keep a Good Woman Down. This was written in 1981. Not in 1881, 1981, okay? Not that long ago, really. Alice Walker is one of the preeminent authors, African-American authors in the United States, actually just author in general. She is incredibly brilliant and very careful about every single thing she puts in her stories. So you can bet that every word in this story is going to be important. Every name in this story is going to be important. Even the way that it is written on the page is important. So I want to talk to you about the story briefly before you try to write a paper about it. So you can't take anything for granted. You have to know about Alice Walker. You have to know about Elethia. All right? A little bit about this author, though, is you have to know that she is also part Cherokee Indian. So her grandmother's Cherokee. If you want some information about that, I do have a link here. All right, let's talk about the story. So I'm going to assume that you have already read it. If you have not yet read the story, please spend 5 minutes reading it right now. I'll wait. Okay, so I'm assuming that you've read it. Okay, here we go. So this, of course, is just an illustrative picture for the piece. This short story is from You Can't Keep a Good Woman Down. And when you look at the short story on the page, the first thing you're going to notice is that it is written in italics. None of the stories in You Can't Keep a Good Woman Down are written in italics. Only this one. This is the shortest short story that Alice Walker seriously has ever written. It's really important to understand that. It's very compact. It's very concentrated. It's almost like a poem. It's so concentrated. So the beginning of the story, we start out with a certain perverse experience shaped Alethia's life and made it possible for it to be true that she carried with her at all times a small apothecary jar of ashes. So the first thing you need to know is, what does apothecary mean? Apothecary, of course, is a pharmacist. An apothecary is a pharmacist. So what we're seeing here is a medicine jar of ashes. Now, the next thing I'm going to ask is, what exactly does Elethia mean? It's a name, right? So we should look up what Elethia means. So and there you go. It means healer. So she's carrying around a jar of ashes, and she is a healer. She's carrying them around in a medicine bottle. So yeah, okay. So here we go. There was in the town where she was born a man whose ancestors had owned a large plantation on which everything under the sun was made or grown. Now, when you look into Alice Walker's life, you will see that Alice Walker is born in a small town called Eatonton, Georgia. Okay? And if you look on the front page of the Eatonton, I guess the best things to do in Eatonton, and you just go down here a little bit, you're going to see that Eatonton, Georgia is the birthplace of Joel Chandler Harris and Alice Walker. So we know Alice Walker's born there, and now we wonder, who is Joel Chandler Harris, okay? So I'm going to look up Joel Chandler Harris. Chandler, not Handler. Okay. And Joel Chandler Harris is a famous journalist that lived at the turn of the century. And he wrote an important book called dun, 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 The Tales of Uncle Remus. Okay? This was made into a famous, or actually infamous, Disney film called Song of the South. So in Tales of Uncle Remus, Joel Chandler Harris shows us an uncle, and I hope you've watched the piece I asked you to watch, Ethnic Notions. It's not easy to watch, I guarantee you, but it is very important for the context of this story. So you know what an uncle is, and the Uncle Remus stories were compiled, I guess, stuck into a Disney piece called Song of the South that came out in 1946 and then was re-released in the 60s, right in the middle of the the civil rights era. I mean, it's astonishing how tone deaf Disney was. So we're gonna look at the Song of the South clip here. Now you can see okay. This is just like a horrible romanticization. Yeah. Okay. It's romanticizing slavery, which is a horrible thing. And that's what happened to a lot of the history of slavery in America. Is a lot of times it was romanticized. Oh, slavery wasn't so bad. Oh, it was a nice institution. There were, nice moments. There's these uncle type characters and these mammies, and everything's just fine, right? It wasn't just fine. So this story, as you could tell because you read it, right? You did read it. Okay. Has in it these Uncle Albert characters. So there's two Alberts in this story. Let me just really be clear about this. First, there's Uncle Albert, who is the dummy in the front window of old Uncle Albert's restaurant, right? And then there's Albert Porter. Now, before I go any further, I want to talk about how Joel Chandler Harris is connected with Alice Walker. You'll see that right here. There was in the town where she was born a man whose ancestors had owned a large plantation on which everything under the sun was made or grown. And that was probably Joel Chandler Harris. So even though she isn't sharing that time contemporaneously in her real life, she is putting herself into the era where someone would share the time contemporaneously with Joel Chandler Harris. And so she's put Elethia in that time. Now, the time that this story takes place in is the turn of the century. And we can tell that because he talks about it and he says that he believes in slavery during his grandfather's time. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to take the end of slavery, which is about 1864, and then we're going to add 40 years to it because 20 years for each generation. So 20 years for the generation of people who were living there, and then 20 years into his grandfather's, so that we've got his grandfather's time. So what we're ending up with is that the story is probably set early 1900s, maybe 808 till 12, something like that. All right. So this is the time of Jim Crow. Jim Crow was a set of laws that put racial inequality into law. Okay, they were championed by the Democrat parties of the southern states. They were the ones who wrote the Jim Crow laws. And the Jim Crow laws were not only enforced in the courts, but they were also enforced by the military wing of the Democrat Party, which was the Ku Klux Klan. So the Ku Klux Klan did a lot of lynching during this time, and the Ku Klux Klan did a lot of terrorizing. They terrorized Black people, and they also terrorized Republicans, and most of the time also Black people were Republican, but they also terrorized white Republicans as well. Okay, so this is Jim Crow, and what they have is a separation of the races during Jim Crow periods. And what happened at the end of the Civil War is Lincoln, who was the first Republican president, was he had gone through this whole war, and he was being pushed by a group of people in his own party called the Radical Republicans to do some really severe things against the Southern Democrats who had caused the insurrection of the Civil War. And they wanted them to be imprisoned. They wanted them to be fined. They wanted them to really pay a heavy price for everything that they had done, all the racist things that they had done. So in order to unify the country, Lincoln decided not to go with the Radical Republicans, and he did not bring a lot of people in the South to justice. He didn't bring judges and politicians and such who were really, really seriously involved in racial inequality to justice. He also did not go after the Ku Klux Klan until a little bit later, and then he attempted to crush it, and he did crush it. It rose again, unfortunately, in the 30s and the 40s. But the original Ku Klux Klan was pretty much crushed. But during this time, when Elethia is going on, the Ku Klux Klan is pretty active, and it's a scary time to be a Black person. But Elethia's kind of lived a sheltered life. She doesn't really realize all of the cruelty and evil that went on during slavery, and also the cruelty and evil that's going on right around her. Because she's a young girl. You know, when you're a kid, you don't really realize that. You're pretty sheltered. So this man, whom Elethia never saw, opened this famous restaurant called Old Uncle Albert's. And of course, this brings up the idea of the old Uncle Remus tales that Joel Chandler Harris wrote. So there's a little bit of bibliographic information here that kind of helps us look at the story that way. Now, we're going to look also at this. Okay, so he has been stuffed. Albert has been stuffed. It says that he was stuffed like a giant bass, like a moose's head. He was stuffed. So there's some stuff going on here, both on a literal and a metaphoric level, all right? So there's two Alberts, as I said. There's Uncle Albert, quote unquote, Uncle Albert, which is the stuffed person, the dummy. And then there's the actual Albert Porter, who was the real man who lived and who died and was stuffed. All right. Two different Alberts. All right. Albert Porter, we first of all have to go into the meaning of his name. So Alice, by the way, means truth. And Alice Walker, it's been said, is actually named after Sojourner Truth. Sojourner Truth was a famous abolitionist. She was a woman who stood over 6 foot tall. She was broad-shouldered, and she spoke with a Dutch accent. Sojourner Truth was a slave on a plantation where the slaves were only taught Dutch, so that when they escaped, or if they escaped, they could not communicate with the people in the town around them to get help, or other slaves. She did learn English and became a very famous speaker for the purpose of abolition. And her most famous speech is "Ain't I a Woman?" because people accused her of being a man because she was a very tall, very broad-shouldered woman. And so she has an impassioned, beautiful speech called "Ain't I a Woman?" That she did. Okay, so Alice Walker, truth, walking, and Sojourner Truth. Sojourner is someone who walks or travels, and then truth, right? So, and Albert is actually the male form of Alice. So Albert is truth, all right? Now, Porter, if you look it up, means someone who carries something is a porter. So the people like at the airport, when you go and you drop off your luggage and they bring it to the plane for you, if you do it on the sidewalk, those are porters. So the people who meet you at the luggage carousel and want to carry your luggage out, they're porters. So Albert Porter actually means the carrier of truth. So, and then we have Uncle Albert, which is kind of a fake romanticized version. So Albert Porter is a carrier of truth. He doesn't deal with falsities. He's straight out. He finds out that his parents were enslaved an extra 10 years. He's really angry about that. He won't leave the house. He won't serve as a master, as a as a head servant. He hates the master, quote unquote, in the plantation house, and the master hates him. But they both are too stubborn. They're kind of locked together, and they can't get Albert to act like a happy Blackie, basically. If you watch Ethnic Notions, you know what that means. All right, they can't get him to act that way. He won't act that way. And he says that anyone who does act that way seriously disremembers their past. And let me see if I can find that.
I didn't get that. Could you try again?
Siri, shh. Okay. Okay. I don't know why Siri's going off. All right. He said, oh, right here. So what does it mean to disremember, and how is that different from forgetting? Of course, forgetting is a passive act. Disremembering is an active act. And the people who are looking at the window display with Albert behind it are disremembering. They're purposefully forgetting the things that Albert stood for. He's been spun. He's become a metaphor of happy slavery. And that is not what he is. So what's happened is the people who stuffed Albert and posed Albert, they have decided that they are going to enslave Albert after his death. He wouldn't act like they wanted him to act as he was alive. So they've decided to enslave his image and then put that image in the front window of this restaurant in a very public place so they can try to also enslave the memories of the people who knew Albert. So they're just going to spin his whole life and change him from who he was, a man who would bury privates, right, to a man who would walk around with a tray near his shoulder and a white napkin draped over his arm. He's not that person, but they have enslaved him. So what does Elethia do with her friends? And they're her close buddies, right? And they call her, this is important stuff here. You have to remember that everything in this piece is important. So one night after the restaurant was closed, someone broke in and stole nothing but Albert. It was Elethia and her friends, boys in the class, who called her Thea. Now, one of the things you have to realize about Thea is that means goddess, okay? And Thunderbird, they bring her Thunderbird, which is very important to understand because Thunderbird is a mythological bird from Native Americans, all right? So she's interwoven in here Native American stuff. And she's also interwoven it, by the way, when you look at what she says here about medicine, okay? So medicine, it's really important. Here's an apothecary jar. Medicine can be two things. So in Western culture, medicine is something that you take if you're ill to be fixed physically. If you're Native American, medicine is like a bundle of important things that you meditate upon. And you fix yourself psychically through your emotions and your psychology. So she is a healer here with her apothecary jar of ashes, which is made of Uncle Albert. They're ashes of Uncle Albert. So we have this frame here where we have the ashes, then we have the story of how the ashes were created. And then at the end, she had her ashes, the old timers' memories, written down, which is important because they're forgetting them. Remember, it says that their eyesight is as good as their memory. And then also friends who wrote that in the army they were learning skills that would get them through more than a plate glass window. Now, remember when this is set. It's set just before World War I. And so World War I is significant here because African American troops were used in World War I. They were segregated from white troops. So they created a lot of African American officers during World War I. And they were in Europe and they were thought of as very big heroes. And they were just Americans to the Europeans. But when they came back to the U.S., they were called boy and they were expected to adhere to Jim Crow laws. And they were not going to have that. They had training, they had guns, and they were done. They were just like, we're done. Okay, you are not calling us boy, and this is not going to happen. So World War I really kind of started to give rise to a movement of African Americans who really wanted to reclaim their autonomy. And it's also a time just after World War I when we get a flowering of African American culture in the Harlem Renaissance. But we also get, right after World War I, a lot of race riots. A lot of riots, mostly not caused by African Americans at all. They're caused by the white people, and then the African Americans are fighting for their lives. They're terrorized by the Ku Klux Klan. It's a terrible thing. Okay, so we have all of this going on. Now, I have a picture of a family of a chief and his two wives and their children. You have to consider that in the South, a lot of African Americans were forced to live on the edges or the outskirts of town. Indians were also told to live on the edges or the outskirts of town. And actually, they blew whistles, like train whistles, to tell them when they could and couldn't be in town. At night, if they were in town when the whistle blew, they could be arrested. It was just awful. That happened both to American Indians and Black people. So they kind of like, they knew each other, they lived near each other, and a lot of times they fell in love. So that's probably what happened with Alice Walker's family. Okay, so I want you to really start looking at how there's two different Alberts here what Alethia's job is as a healer, and how this frame structure works. Also, why exactly is it in italics? So these are all questions that you might deal with your paper. And of course, there's also that biographical sideline that you might take. All right, I hope that helps. Take care.